G'day everybody, and welcome to the summary session of our podcast. You
forgot how many there were then, didn't you, Brett?
I did.
Forgot the number.
I did forget how many there were.
It's been a few, yeah.
There's been a lot on this topic of droplet, airborne and contact precautions. And we've got Phil and myself and Martin, and we're going to try and synthesize or summarize what we've heard across these podcasts to date. And before we get onto that, I just want to say a big thanks to all our speakers and guests that we've had on over the past few weeks. We've really had to try and compact this down to a couple of weeks, and really grateful for people to give up a few minutes of their time just to be able to help with this series. We hope you've also enjoyed them. But before we do that, we might flick to, well, who wants to go first? Phil, do you want to tell us about what's been one of the memorable things or one of the key things that you think you've heard from this series that we've done so far?
Thanks, Brett. I think it's been really insightful. I've been fortunate enough to speak to a few of the clinicians who are working in the deep, dark parts of COVID and in various parts of acute care and long-term care facilities, and the experiences that they had and the issues that they had with the droplet precautions and airborne precautions. And I think my general sense is that most people seems to be thinking that these categories that we like to put people in, and we like to, practice by categories, that it's really doesn't work for infection prevention and control, because I think, as we've heard from a number of our speakers, there's that spectrum, and there's one extreme to the other, and it's very difficult to have a cutoff point as to when to bring in these particular interventions. So we need to be thinking about spectrums, and we need to thinking about a continuum of infectious precautions, I think. And my overall general sense is that there tends to be general agreement that we need to review the current paradigms, and we need to be thinking about new ones that can best protect our healthcare workers and our patients.
We might come to the new ones in a minute, but the other thing that I've heard, not necessarily in so many words, but perhaps indirectly, I think there are a lot of people who've been really burnt and worn out having this discussion, or not having this discussion, or trying to have this discussion. And I think there's been some really strongly held views on both sides, not call sides, but for different perspectives. And I think some people have found that really hard to navigate through over the last year or two, regardless of what their personal views were, and being able to have an open discussion about this. I think people have found that a little bit challenging, I think. What do you think, Martin?
Really tricky. I mean, unfortunately, you put up a scientific view on Twitter, you immediately get pulled down by all the people with extremely polarised views in a not particularly pleasant way. Some of them are, not healthcare workers, and they're people with an agenda. And I know many people have put up what they felt was a fairly innocent and rational point, and they've been absolutely castigated for it. So that's been really tricky. I think social media is a very useful thing, but actually in the context of this, it hasn't always been particularly helpful, I don't think, unfortunately. And, it's a good way to get a message over, but it's a good way to get yourself burnt. And I know a couple of very eminent IPC folk who actually came off Twitter and deleted their account and have actually gone back, but sort of a much quieter way.
Yeah.
So that's been a bit disappointing, because this polarization, we're all going to have to come together, and we're going to need to have discussions about this in a non-emotional way when this has started to settle, and that may be some time yet. But that's a difficult thing, really, because I think it was Belinda who said we've got to make decisions about when people are less emotional about this, and the polarization has been difficult, I think.
Yeah, and I think John Otter made a similar point to this, I think, in his podcast. And I think some of the suggestions we heard from him, for example, were different terminology, so that people are not trying to refer back to something that's already being used because there's already fixated views on that terminology, whether it be droplet or aerosol or whatever it might be, and to come up with some new words to describe what we're trying to achieve, to take out some of that heat. So that was, I think, an interesting thing I heard, and probably sort of along the same lines. Ramon Shaban mentioned about just talking, and probably at times talking about similar things, but from different disciplines, we're meaning different things. Or we're meaning the same thing, but talking about them using different terminology, and a bit of sense of confusion about that. So I think that was an interesting point as well.
There were some other really good points as well, like it's not just the organism, it's the setting. You know, what's your room ventilation like? What's your local humidity like? You know, what's your airflow through your building like in that particular type of setting, and the number of people you might find in. You know, there's a lot of physics involved in this, in transmission, and I'm not sure by putting things into small boxes we can say that applies in absolutely every setting, because you could easily have a hospital which has fantastic ventilation and they're not going to have so much of an issue, and another one which has terrible ventilation, and yet people are doing IPC well, but the ventilation is absolutely awful. Yeah. And trying to fit one set of guidelines into a healthcare system that has buildings dating from Queen Victoria's time to, a very modern hospital, it's a very difficult thing to do, really.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I'll sidetrack for a minute, as usual, as we usually do on this podcast. But if you think about contact precautions and the use of gown and gloves in some instances, where some studies have shown not beneficial to use those. But the context is important, because some of those studies have been done where there's been essentially 100% side rooms. So, it's a very different context to having shared spaces. And I'm not... I won't get the ins and outs about gloves and gowns. That's another podcast series for another day. But I think, the point is right. It's really, really important to think about the diversity of the setting. I know we talk about risk assessments, so that's essentially what it is. But it's the diversity of all those different things that are going to be really important to consider.
Yeah,
I'm surprised at the number of people who said dump contact precautions as well. So I thought that was a good point. Sorry, Phil, I interrupted you there.
Yeah, no, I was going to say I think that's a really good point, because we talk about this individual risk assessment procedure that we're supposed to go through, but we really still continue to put people in categories. So I think there's a bit of work to do there. I've lost my train of thought.
It wouldn't be the first time, Phil.
Excellent. Right. No, it wouldn't be the first time.
It is late in the evening.
There's one in there somewhere. I thought I'd just see it sneak out of your left ear.
The other thing, I think it might have been John Otter, but mentioned, the infectious dose component to this too. And it was something that was really tightly held at the start of COVID-19. People were talking about, well, what's the infectious dose relative to the type of risk and precautions? And we drifted away a lot from that. But if we're thinking about how we set new paradigms, it's still an important concept to throw in the mix along with all the other things that we've just spoken about. Because we might have something that is as a long-term range in terms of infectious particle transmission process, and might have a very, very low infective dose to be able to cause an issue. Or any mixture of those two combinations, require a really high infectious dose to actually cause clinical infection or even asymptomatic infection. And so we still don't need to throw all those types of things out. We still need to be thinking about those intricacies for different infectious diseases.
The thing is, they seem to shift, though, don't they? Because as the variants change, they seem to become more infectious. Now, that the target site of the organism changed particularly, or was that the infectious dose changed particularly, or the fact that people stopped wearing masks in trains and wherever, so they were being exposed to more of the organism, which would infect them. I find it almost impenetrable, to be honest.
Yeah,
at times.
That's right. So I think the other thing we heard of broadly for me is that people were saying, whatever we come up with, it has to be simple, and it has to be something that healthcare workers can implement and be practical. And so I think we heard a little bit about contact and this concept of contact and respiratory protection. People sort of called it different things, and I think that generally, that's what I was hearing across many of the podcasts, was this sort of concept of bundling this in together and having contact and then respiratory-based precautions. Yeah. And within that respiratory-based precautions, I think we heard different views. There were some that were saying perhaps respiratory is respiratory, so go with what we know and assume that it's going to be fine particles. And others thinking about that need to risk assess within that particular frame to think about all the things that might constitute or impact on the top of a caution that you might need. That's good in theory. Makes it very hard to implement.
Well, it's tricky though, isn't it? Because, respiratory, TB, who would think of putting on gloves and a plastic apron?
Yeah.
We never consider that to be contact at all.
No.
And yet there are likely to be elements of COVID that are potentially contact because of touching a surface and then maybe touching a mucous membrane, which would be fine if you could get hand hygiene up to the 3,000% that we always think it is. Because then you'll be okay with a face shield and a mask and clean your hands before, when you take your PPE off, and just don't touch your mucous membranes. But in reality, back on planet Earth, people don't comply. I hate that word. But people don't always follow the guidance that well. So is that us not selling the message properly, or is it that the guidance is wrong? Sometimes there is maybe a more mixed, nuanced way. And we heard the word nuance quite a lot, actually, when we were talking to people. So there is this continuum, which was another popular word. And I think a good, open, honest discussion about, okay, really, how could this individual organism transmit from that particular person? Because you might have somebody who's positive sitting in the corner of a bay, breathing quietly through their nose, not raising their voice, not coughing, not shouting, not singing. What's the transmission risk from them? Whereas there's somebody else who's maybe confused, who's shouting their head off in the other corner of the room, who's positive, they're going to be more of a transmission risk. I mean, I'm really querying AGPs, to be absolutely honest, because breathing is an aerosol generating procedure. An aerosol generating behaviour. And I really like that in some of the Australian papers. People talk about aerosol generating behaviours. Yeah. Because unless you're dead, you're producing an aerosol.
I don't disagree with you, Martin. I think the hard part about that sort of differentiation about someone who's quietly sitting in the corner and not doing anything versus, Mr. Smith who's shouting and coughing is that kind of thing is very difficult to implement. And people's course within any kind of infectious disease is going to change. And their behaviours might change as other things settle in once they're in hospital. So then you would say, well, why don't we just assume that we need to go to the highest level of protection for anything that we would warrant that could be transmitted via that route? But on the flip side, we also heard was things like the need to be able to communicate effectively with people and patients. We see it a fair bit on Twitter. There's quite a bit of discussion, and I've seen lots of clinicians on Twitter talk about, I took my face mask off because I was giving someone some horrendous news. And I did my own little assessment. They tested negative, that morning. They're not symptomatic. And I just needed to show and communicate as a human this horrible news that I might be giving them. That could be what I now heard seen on Twitter, or they're having really intimate discussions with people about highly sensitive things where ultimately there needs to be that human contact and trust and all those types of things that are built up. So, they're all really valid, important considerations. I think we've got a lot of work to do to make respiratory protection better for healthcare workers and for patients.
But then you might want to know about the room they're doing that in, because so often those little conversations where you maybe would take the patient out to a smaller room, the ventilation in that room might be horrific.
Yeah.
Whereas in the bay, it might be fantastic. I don't think we always know enough about our working environment and about how effective our own ventilation systems are. And, maybe there's some really good assessments need to go on, an honest assessment of what's actually within our building, and say, okay, in this room, it's fine to do that. And in that room, it's probably not so good to do that. Because I certainly saw transmission happening when I worked in the front line in very small rooms where people would have a meeting, and I could tell from the fact that everyone was flagging a bit in the meeting. I know we're all tired, but I didn't have a CO2 meter at the time. I bet it had rocketed, and in some of those meetings, transmission happened, and yet it never actually happened in the clinical area. So I don't think we know quite enough about our own physical settings either.
Yeah, look, I agree. I think I like to keep things simple, and the hierarchy of controls, I think, is a really nice framework that we can look at how we're approaching this. And it's the first step is all about the design of these places and the hospitals. And I think sometimes we can be really hard on ourselves because we're subject to the design that we're working in and the environment that we're working in. And we don't always have the evidence to back us up on what we're doing. We can only go on what we know. But clearly, I think, that hierarchy of risk with infection prevention control, starting off with the design of facilities, is really crucial. And perhaps I'm, being a little bit utopian here, and we're never actually going to get there because we're always going to be limited by budget restrictions and all that sort of stuff. But, we need to, I think, sort of be a little bit kinder on ourselves, because as the first line of defense, we're not always working in the best environment. And so we need to, accept the fact that sometimes we need to maybe compromise.
Yeah. And we've heard this in previous podcasts from people like Jason Monty and Simon Witts and others, where there's been a real call to say we need to get new standards for things like healthcare when we're talking about new building design. And, that's clearly not in our domain. That's for others to work out. But I think what we can do is support that agenda, because we do need that. We need really, if something's being built now, we need it to be future-proof and deal with the issues that we know that COVID and other infectious diseases can present. Unless we start changing building codes and building regulations that make these things enforceable, to understand, that every room needs to be really well ventilated. I mean, we just need to do it from the scratch, and we need to do it when we're building or having major renovation.
And thinking, actually, okay, that's the intended purpose of that room, but what might it be used for in the future? Because people like me will go along and go, actually, we don't need a ward day room anymore, so we're going to turn that into a meeting room. And the ward day room is somewhere where people went for like an hour a day to eat their lunch, as opposed to somewhere where people are sitting in offices all day long, and you might find the ventilation in there isn't suitable, whereas it might have been suitable for the original purpose. So, we try and be flexible in healthcare, and we try and think, okay, that will work better there, that will work better there. But we don't always think, actually, what were the other things we needed to do to make sure that was safe? Was that actually factored in when we built this? And therefore, can we do this in a safe way? Sticking bay doors on open wards because of norovirus ends up not working for many other things, because that's not the way the ventilation system was designed, for actually sticking an extra wall and a door in, and that's not how the airflows would work. So we have to think a little bit more about that as well.
So what do you think? Any other big ticket items? I mean, my sort of, as I said before, my summary was about this idea of having contact and respiratory based precautions. Do you agree? Both agree with that, or did you hear any other themes that we could use to take forward?
I'm quite happy with that, to be absolutely honest. It does make it simpler, and as Phil quite rightly said, we have to make it simple because we have to be able to sell this to other people. I'm still not sure we completely understand everything we're doing, so I think honest discussions with physicists and I think the era of genome sequencing actually may enable us to do fantastic research on really looking at what are the transmission pathways, because to me at the moment they're a guess. It's here's a theory and that probably should fit, and that's what infection control has always been based on. That's that is what we're most likely to have happened, but I'm not sure that really works that well in the real world. And I think with modern science now we can do much better on our transmission pathways. And I love the podcast we did with Pat Harris and Trish and Belinda up in Queensland, where they actually looked at their transmission pathways of community MRSA and was showing that there was no transmission going on in the hospital. They're able to stop all contact precautions and isolation for it and save themselves millions of dollars a year. And that's the future, I think. We've got to be much more open to using these technologies to actually work out what's really going on here, and therefore where we're going to get the biggest bang for our buck. Never going to be perfect, but it does enable us, I think, going forward, to design better studies to actually get better information, but then act on it, because that's what we're not being great at. And I think many people have acknowledged in the podcast we were wrong, and we have to say, do you know what, we got it wrong, and that's okay, because good scientists say, I think I was wrong there, and don't stick to the dogma. So I think a bit of honest. I think most people think we were wrong, and I think most of us know we weren't correct, but we weren't doing it out of malice. It was out of what we thought was the best information at the time, and we'd have better information now. So
Yeah.
I'll get off the soapbox now.
Yeah, no, I agree entirely, man. I think the direction we're heading in is the right direction, and I think we need to bring more people into the conversation. But I guess the real question is, who's gonna act on this?
Yeah, I think we asked a couple of people that comment. I think I might have asked Kathy Dempsey that question. And I think it probably does need to start at the top. A lot, and when I say the top, I'm talking about national bodies, groups, and the WHO. I think we need that first, and I think the refinements can come. And just accept that whatever we start with as a new concept, let's just say it's the best we've got now. We can modify it. We will modify it. And when evidence changes or we come up with better ideas, we can just tweak it. As opposed to saying we have to get it 100% right. I don't think we're going to when we come out with a new concept. It's going to be something that's going to evolve. And I think we've just got to be mature about that and go, okay, it's not going to be 100%, but let's accept it. It's better than what we've got. And let's see how it works, and let's refine it and keep tweaking it until it's better than that better. So, because I think that's where we're at risk of doing that. When something new gets proposed, we're either going to go, yeah, let's do it, or there's going to be people who go, but that's not right because of X, Y, and Z. And that could be quite right, but we don't want those things to stymie something being taken forward.
No, I mean, it's never going to be 100% right, as you say. And I have enormous sympathy for people who have to write a national guideline because they're trying to write something for all settings. What I would like to see is a bit more transparency about how the decision was taken, and maybe a bit more, some more public explanations about, okay, yes, that might be right, but we have to take into account of this factor, and this factor, because there's possibly factors going on that we, aren't shared at frontline grassroots settings. So, and that then leads to a lot of discontent amongst people who've got to implement a guideline which isn't practical. And Christine Peters actually made a really good point, which is when we're writing a guideline, we should involve the people who've actually got to implement it.
Yeah.
Because we're particularly good at writing a guideline that nobody can actually do in the real world. And so therefore it's not going to work. So I think involving frontline people in actually writing what we're suggesting people can then practically do is a very good thing to do.
Yeah, and I was about to say exactly the same thing. I think there needs to be a national, international approach, but as part of that, it absolutely has to involve different disciplines and people who have to implement this. Now, that includes healthcare workers who have to implement it. It has to include the people at the hospital level, the management level, who are going to try and have to implement this from a policy point of view, and or a state or whatever it might be. So we certainly need to include many people in that discussion.
I mean, I have to say, I found it fascinating, and I found it fascinating going back and listening again. I'm not saying to everybody go and listen to all the podcasts twice, but because you pick up different nuances as well when you hear something a second time. So I've thoroughly enjoyed all of these discussions, and I don't think I disagree with virtually anything people have said. But it's coming up with something that's simple, practical, easy to sell, easy to implement is really difficult to do.
Oh, yeah.
When all we talk about is continuum.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, the other thing that was touched on by a few people was, and again, I know this is not the point of this podcast, but the concept of contact precautions versus sort of enhancing what we have by way of standard precautions. And maybe some of the things we do as contact precautions we don't need to do if we actually got some of the standard precautions elements right. And we heard that in different contexts, I think, referred to by different people. And then quite, people like Jenny Wilson clearly talking about things like glove misuse, if you like, or gloves not being used appropriately and the risks that actually then presents. So, there's that sort of other side, which I hope doesn't derail the other element around respiratory precautions, because I think that the other element, the contact standard precautions, I think that also needs to get looked at, but I don't want that to hold up the other part.
Yeah, Maria and Belinda made that point as well. I mean, while we were actually walking around wearing gloves and whole body PPE for something that is respiratory.
Yeah.
I think that needs a review, and it's not great for a sustainable planet either, to be honest, to go completely in one direction. But yeah, been fascinating. Really enjoyed
Fascinating
it.
indeed, yeah. So we hope that everybody has enjoyed this podcast series, and I hope this helps take the discussion forward a little bit more, and someone out there in the right roles and positions can help drive this forward nationally or locally, whatever it might be. But I think the other important thing is people to share their ideas as they come up with them, and when there are new ideas put forward, really get engaged in any consultation process that might happen as part of that, so that all these sort of things can be factored in and considered. So we've heard from a range of people. I'm not going to call anyone an expert, because I think we've already had a discussion on who's an expert on this podcast. So let's not use that word.
That put us out of it straight away.
So we've spoken to a range of people, predominantly though in infection control, infectious diseases, microbiology, clinical scientists, behavioural scientists, and so we're aware of that, and we are going to have some other perspectives from the area of physicists to wrap this up, and air scientists. So just to wrap up this podcast series, we're going to have those perspectives, and look forward to hearing those, but also want to thank you all for listening to this podcast series. Hope you found it interesting, and look forward to talking some more on this topic in future podcasts.
Well, maybe we'll leave this topic for a little while.
Yeah, we won't come back to this for a little while yet.
Not for a little while. We will be back though, but we won't do it just yet, I don't think.
Yeah, I think we've done this one to death.
Thanks,
for the time being.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you.